You wrote this week, did some reporting on what Republican senators are thinking, at least what they'll tell you, about Trump.
They're not feeling very good about it. The answers that they gave when I mentioned that Trump has surged to the front of the pack range from thinking he's going to go away to saying he's not good for the Republican Party. Jeff Flake, I don't think he's
any endorsements in that group?
Not a single endorsement, John. Even Jeff Sessions, who's aligned with him on sort of on the issue of immigration, not rhetorically at least, but policy-wise, said he doesn't know if Trump is good for the Republican Party.
And the candidates don't want to jump on him either on the campaign trail. I mean, Scott Walker was lucky enough to have his campaign announcement last week, so he didn't get, blown under by all this quite as much, but it's going to continue to be a problem for a lot of these candidates to get out there.
And the Democrats love it. You've heard Hillary Clinton, just kind of cheer him on. Martin O'Malley call him a racist. This is exactly what Democrats want to see, because what they're saying is Donald Trump is the standard bearer for the rest of the party. And even if that's not actually true, it's an easy line for them to make that's going to appeal to a lot of voters in the middle.
And Republicans know they can't go after him because if you hit him, he will hit back very hard.
As we saw with Lindsey Graham this week.
Any talk from the Republican senators about doing something to slow Trump down, or they just feel they have to wait and hope for the best?
I think they're keeping their fingers crossed.
Hey, John McCormick, you were just talking about Scott Walker, who you cover. Talk about what that's been like lately. He's just had his big announcement. You've been out on the trail with him, hanging out. How's he doing?
He's doing okay. He had a couple several unscripted moments last week during his rollout where things happened, and he reacted fairly well on his feet. I get better access to him than you probably do to Hillary Clinton.
Probably a little bit, just a little.
Just by a little bit.
I'd ask him a question.
Every campaign event I go to, in the Rubio campaign or anything else on the Republican side, they always joke about Hillary Clinton being bad with the press.
So do the other Democratic candidates, especially the O'Malley team.
It's still, I mean, she's the only one with Secret Service. Some of the governors have troopers, but you can walk up to Scott Walker. The troopers don't stop.
Yeah, you can ask him about Pabst Blue Ribbon, which is what I did, last week, and I had a nice little off-the-record conversation about his favorite beers and that we should have a sampling some evening. And this is the time of the cycle where you can actually have access to these people.
Well, some of these people.
I know you said this is off the record, but does he like PBR or?
He actually said he's more of a Leinenkugels man, he leaves the PBR to the hipsters.
Next time he brings up PBR, and ask him if he will take some Heilmann's Old Style should be his beer.
I was actually surprised by the issue of access because as you were behind a rope at Hillary, the same day in Wolfboro, Marco Rubio and Chris Christie were marching in a parade probably 30 yards apart, and every reporter there was just bouncing back and forth the whole walk of the parade.
But they want to make the news, and she is okay if she doesn't.
And a lot of it there in that instance in New Hampshire a couple weeks ago was actually having to do with Secret Service and kind of poor advance work, less than it actually being about the media and the press team actually trying to control it. It was much more about some of the other people who are part of the equation because she is somebody with Secret Service protection, because she is a candidate who has so many reporters on her trail all the time.
And did you personally get lassoed?
I wasn't actually there. I was actually off for the 4th of July weekend.
Where she's sort of this towering figure that anything she says or does is going to get massive amounts of media coverage, and she never has to fight for it. Unlike I think every one of the other candidates.
Except for maybe Trump. So Scott Walker, your candidate, who you cover, he's been both criticized and praised for being in his set stump speech remarkably on message and disciplined. You've had some unstructured time with him. I had some time last week in Iowa. He's pretty good in those unstructured cases, right?
Yeah, no, he is. There was a week ago, he was in Davenport, and a homeless Vietnam War veteran approached him. He happened to be wearing Harley-Davidson gear, as Scott Walker tends to do once in a while himself. And the man said he wanted to pray with him. And, this is probably a good moment for Scott Walker because he wants to reach out to social conservatives, but he put his arms around the man and grabbed his head, and he prayed with him. That was a little risky. You don't know how that's going to turn out as all the cameras are on you capturing that moment. It turned out okay for him, but it showed that he's willing to take a risk.
It might have been a little riskier to run away.
That's the kind of thing that happens with me all the time, by the way. It's hard to deal with that when people come up.
Melinda Henneberger, talk about Jeb Bush as a candidate doing improvised stuff. How has he been as you've observed him?
The times I've seen, not as adept. The one time I was with him in Las Vegas, and he had been behaving as though he had all the time in the world and really pretty much connecting pretty well with voters. So he walks away from the voters into a space with reporters. It's like personality change immediately. Now he's yelling expressing real unhappiness with an aide who admittedly was going to walk him to a space where there were a few protesters to have the availability. That's not where you want to have your availability.
And Jeb somehow knew that.
But he might have handled it with a little more aplomb with the aide.
So wait, you're saying you saw Jeb Bush yelling at an aide in front of the press?
Correct.
Not great. Okay.
Correct.
On some level, this is almost a little bit predictable, right? Because of the politicians in the field, Jeb Bush is the only candidate who has not held elected office since, I think, Facebook or Twitter existed. It's been a really long time since he's done this. So
and the funniest thing was, he says again in front of the whole press corps, and I want to go home now.
And he knew you could hear?
Absolutely. And I'm sure a lot of the candidates feel that way, but to say that.
But you also spent some time with Trump, I think, in Baltimore, and you saw Trump behaving in a rather, maybe less surprisingly, but a really unpolitician-like way.
Well, Trump is kind of, I think, the anti-politician on a lot of levels, right? But you bring a baby up to Trump, and his reaction is kind of like, ugh, baby.
I didn't even touch my own.
Anyone who wants to come and have a picture with him, he's okay, but make it snappy. Instead of trying to use that moment to connect with the person.
How do you think Chris Christie does with babies?
I think generally, in terms of with people, I think he does pretty good. I think his image is, I'm a dad. I have 4 kids. I'm comfortable with people. I'm comfortable with, families. So I think he does pretty good on that front.
A hugger.
Yeah, he does. He does.
The other thing was,
he did hug Barack.
Let me ask you about another metric besides hugging for Christie, which is fundraising. Just announced his finance committee. He's not in the first tier in fundraising, which I think once upon a time he assumed he would be. How are they feeling on the Christie campaign about where he stands on?
Well, the big news this week was that Meg Whitman has signed on as one of his co-chairs. I guess the feeling within the campaign was that was really a good get for them. She's someone who's very vital in the business world, incredibly wealthy, incredibly powerful. So I think they were all in all pretty happy with that.
To go with Carly Fiorina.
Yes.
Yeah,
right?
I think she's actually tempted to go with Jeb Bush. Yeah. Jen Epstein, just give us your sense. We talked about it earlier in the show. Where do they feel? How do the Clinton people feel the week is ending with this email thing?
I think that they think that this is totally not how they wanted to end it. They, were not happy with the initial New York Times story. I think that they've been satisfied by the various corrections to it and the subsequent reporting, which is all kind of suggested this was people around her, that it was not necessarily going to be a criminal case, that all of that just kind of makes it better. But just to re-inject email into it when she's trying to focus on the economy and focus on grassroots organizing is not the dynamic.
Not a perfect way to end the week.
Yeah.